Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Jesus and the Samaritan woman, John chapter 4, verses 1 through 42. We've been seeing in this section several conversations. Going back to chapter 3, we saw Nicodemus speaking with Jesus, and the subject of the new birth comes up. Then we saw a conversation with John the Baptist and his own disciples, chapter 3, verses 22 through 36, where John talked about how he must increase, or Jesus must increase, but John must decrease. Um, and now we come to this conversation with Jesus and this Samaritan woman, where he's going to speak to her about the reality of living water. So our story begins, chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, and we looked last time at how that had set up a little bit of a conflict is too strong of a word, but there was an issue, and remember the disciples of John had said, "Who does that fellow think he is? You know, he's the one you baptized, and you gave him a start, and now people are going to him." And that news gets not just to them, but notice it's not about them. The Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John. And then there's a little corrective note. Although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, lest anyone say, well, I was baptized by Jesus. No, he wasn't actually doing that. But Jesus, in order to forestall a certain thing, we're going to come back and see how this all fits together. But he left Judea and went away again into Galilee. Now, when he says that he left Judea, went away into Galilee, notice verse 4, and he had to pass through Samaria, the way you would normally do this. If you were Jewish and you were going from Judea to Galilee, you wouldn't just go straight north. You'd leave Jerusalem, you'd go down to the Jordan River, and you'd follow the Jordan River up, bypassing the area of Samaria. Either that way or you might take the same route along the coast, but you wouldn't go through Samaria. Um, why? Because there were certain political realities. Indeed, normally, if you make that trip, even today, if you're at Jerusalem and you're going to go up to Galilee, you don't go in a straight line. You go either to the coast, and I've done both. I've gone along the coast and north, or you go down to the Jordan River, and there's a road there along the Jordan River, and you follow it up to Galilee. And the reason you're doing it today is for the same reason they did it back then. That's territory. Today they call that the West Bank Palestinian territory. Um, but there's some issues between the people, the Palestinians, versus the Jews. Has been for 2,000 years. There were back then too, although instead of saying Palestinian, what you would say for those particular people, they were Samaritans. And they were people who had been settled there, but when they had settled there, they had intermarried with some of the people that were already there. So you say, are they Jewish or not? And it's, well, sort of or not, or Jewish, sort of both at the same time, a little bit. And so they thought of themselves, because they had converted to Judaism, but their Judaism didn't look exactly like the Judaism of the Jews. Yeah, even today it doesn't. If you read the Samaritan Pentateuch, and they have their own copies of the Pentateuch, they are slightly different. There's a couple of areas where they're different. It's by and large the same Hebrew text, but there's a couple places where, for one reason or another, there has been a change. uh, and there's still Samaritans there today. That hasn't gone away. There's not a lot of them, but there are some. My daughter and her husband had a chance to sit down with some Samaritans and actually meet their high priest. They still have a high priest who does their thing. But Jesus is going through this area. And so he feels like he's not taking the detour. He has to go through Samaria, and that's going to lead to our entire story here. Verse 5, so he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar. Now, that city of Sychar is still there today. In fact, if you're looking at a picture of it, it's flanked on two sides by two high hills, or you want to call them mountains, Mount Gerizim on one side and Mount Ebal on the other. When the Israelites first came into this land, they had come to this territory, this area, and half of them had stood on one mountain, half of them had stood on the other, and they had gone through the covenant ceremony where the ones on one side yelled out the blessings of the covenant, and the people on the other side yelled out the curses, and it must have been a tremendous sound. Well, that city was still there. They weren't calling it Shechem anymore. That was its ancient name. Now the pronunciation of the name had changed a bit. So instead of Shechem, now it's Sychar. And this city was here. Notice it was near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. That is, this is going to be the land of the tribe of Ephraim. But the tribe of Ephraim isn't there anymore. Remember, they'd been taken away in the Assyrian captivity. And so verse 6, and Jacob's well, notice we've got two mentions. We're going to have another before we're out of this chapter, of Jacob. There's a point that's being made. It's supposed to tie you into Jacob. We're going to come back and look at that in a minute. But Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. You ever think that Jesus got tired? He did. Because it was about the 6th hour. Now, when the synoptics, when Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about the 6th hour, they're usually talking about 6 hours after sunrise. I don't think John is. When you look up all the references to time that John makes, I think he's adopting instead the Roman system of telling time, which would be probably 6 in the afternoon. If it was noon, Jesus might have been a little worried, but not that much because he'd only been walking for the first part of the day. But now it's been all day, I think. So it was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." And so far, nothing too untoward, except, well, we're going to see there were some cultural distinctions. But verse 8, for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. So this is letting us know that this is going to be a private conversation. This woman comes and Jesus comes, and as far as we can tell, there's nobody else there at this point. Now, we'd had a conversation earlier, and these stories are sort of, I think, in contrast to each other, of Nicodemus coming. And that hadn't been the 6th hour. That had been at night. Remember, Nicodemus, he was from high society. The Samaritan woman, we're going to find out she's a bit of an outcast, it looks like, from society. Nicodemus had actually actively sought to meet Jesus. This woman, this is a chance encounter. There's no plans for her to have a meeting and a conversation. In Nicodemus's case, he's very serious in his attitude. She's a little flippant, and I think she's going to try to be pulling the chain of Jesus a bit. A little bit of mockery. Nicodemus, he's very highly educated. She's got no formal education that we know of. In the case of Nicodemus, he's a man, she's a woman, and remember, in that culture, that made a big difference. There was no equality of the genders. In Nicodemus's case, he's a very moral man. She seems to have, I'm assuming here, maybe wrongly, but she seems to have a history of immorality. In both cases, they both need Jesus, and neither one at the outset actually realizes it. Now, I said there is a motif going on, a well motif. When you see Jesus meeting this woman by a well, you have to understand that there is something that took place in the Old Testament. Yeah, and remember how Jacob was mentioned? Well, the Jacob story eventually has a well in it. You remember the story where Jacob comes to Haran and he sees Rachel by the well, and let me just say, it's love at first sight. And that sets up, actually, there's probably a motif set up even before this, where years earlier, the mother of Jacob had come to the same well, and a servant of Abraham had come, and they had met, but that wasn't really a romance, although it turned into one because she came back with the servant to meet Isaac, and that's how Rebekah and Isaac had become married. But I left that one out of here. And so Jacob meets Rachel by the well. The next time you read of a well in the Old Testament, it's Moses who's on the run from Egypt, and the Pharaoh's after him, and he comes to a well in the land of Midian, and he meets Zipporah, and the guy meets the girl by the well, and the rest is history. It's love at first sight, or at least marriage. The next time you see it, the well's not actually mentioned, but if you look for it, in the Ruth and the Boaz story, there's a reference to the water pots, and the water pots are there because there's a well. And the girl meets the guy by the well, and it's a romance. And so here, as Jesus meets a woman by the well, there's a motif there that says, okay, this is going to be a romance, but not a physical romance, but rather a spiritual romance. And I want you to set up for that. Therefore, the Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink since am a Samaritan woman? So there's the man-woman thing, but there's also the Jew-Samaritan thing. And notice the writer, John the writer, explains, for the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. They wouldn't enter into a conversation. If a Jew and a Samaritan came together, it's going to be either fireworks or just polite, cold silence. And Jesus had broken that silence by asking this woman for a drink of water. Verse 10, Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God, and the implication, but you don't, but there's a gift there. If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Now, when you said living water, that's a figure of speech to describe moving water as opposed to water that's just standing still. But that's going to become a picture of something else. You see, Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13, my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. Do you catch that? To hew for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. So notice that the living water was a picture of God's truth and God's life that people had rejected, and they sort of made their own artificial truth that wasn't really truth at all. It wouldn't hold up, wouldn't hold anything. Jeremiah goes on, Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 13, O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake thee will be put to shame. Those who turn away on earth will be written down because they have forsaken the fountain of living water, even the Lord. So there's some Old Testament precedent to that, and Jesus says this to her about living water, and she hears his words, and she says, Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? She looks at Jesus, and there's no rope, no pot, no. In fact, he admitted his own helplessness. He had said, can you get me a drink of water? Verse 12, you are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us the well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle. And by mentioning Jacob, I think she's actually intending, now maybe I'm misreading her, but it sounds a little bit like she's saying this just to make a little dig at him. Because that would normally get a Jewish person rather angry. Your father Jacob, that's our father. You're just, you're nobody. You're not even Gentiles. You're sort of a half-breed mix of some Jews and Gentiles. But notice the Samaritans referred to Jacob as their father. Now, they weren't denying that he was the father of the Jews too. But they're saying, no, he's our father. And the Jews wanted to keep that separate. That really just annoyed them. By the way, I think they've somewhat gotten over that. I understand that Samaritans today actually have an Israeli passport. That's unusual. That's not like the rest of Palestinians. So they are on a little bit different plane today. But that wasn't the case back then. And there was some bad blood back then. In fact, there were times when the Samaritans had snuck into Jerusalem and had snuck into the temple and tried to desecrate the temple in Jerusalem. So there was some really bad blood there. So when she says, you're not greater than our father Jacob, she's waiting to see Jesus get angry. But instead, verse 13, Jesus answered and said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst, but the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. You see, he says, the water you're talking about that you've come to pick up, that's temporary. And sure enough, she's at the well today. She probably was at the well yesterday. She's been at the well probably every day for a very long time. And she's going to have to come back tomorrow if she, because water doesn't last unless it's spiritual water, a permanent source. And notice how he describes not just the permanence, but the permanence of source. The water that I will give him will become in him not just water that stays, but a well of water springing up to eternal life. A source of water. Jesus offers to give not just living water, not just moving water, but the source of that water. Verse 15, the woman said to him, Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty nor come all the way here to draw. Jesus speaks of a spiritual reality. Notice how she assumes a literal interpretation. You can't always do that. And there's been a history. We're going to come back and look at it. There's a history of that, not just in this chapter, but previously leading up to this chapter here in the Gospel of John. Verse 16, he said to her, go call your husband. Notice he changes, or so it seems. It seems that he changes the topic. Go call your husband and come here. And that's a problem. The woman answered and said, well, I have no husband. And Jesus said to her, you have correctly said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands. And the one whom you now have is not your husband. It makes you wonder whose husband was it that he. Now, I'm assuming just because of the number, and it could be that this had all been innocent. Maybe she'd gone through 5 husbands that had died. But when she says, and the one whom you have now is not your husband, she sounds like she has a husband that's not her husband. Might be someone else's husband, or at least they're unmarried. So there's an issue there, I think. I think there's an issue there and it's a sore spot for her. And so he says, boy, have you said truly, this is, you don't have a husband. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. After all, there was nothing about her that could visually distinguish her to this Jewish person who had never been in town, didn't know anybody else there. And so obviously Jesus has shown some knowledge that was just unusual. And so because you're a prophet, now she's going to, I think, try to deftly turn the subject away. You see, I think what Jesus did, he wasn't really changing the subject. He was showing her her need. But she's going to try to divert that. Let's talk about something theological. Verse 20. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you, and notice the translators inserted the word people, in other words, you plural, y'all, say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Let's talk theology and get off the topic of my husband's and my not husband and my somebody else's husband. So let's talk instead about worship and where you ought to worship, because that was at the heart of one of the big issues between Jews and Samaritans. The Jews worshipped in Jerusalem at the temple there, and the Samaritans back then and even today still have a place of worship here on one of these mountains. Where they have an altar and a tabernacle, and they still do all of the animal sacrifices that were done by the Jews. Jews don't do that anymore because there's no temple there. But the Samaritans still to this day do sacrifices, and they're still part of that sacrificial system. So this mountain, that's where we worship. You say Jerusalem. Where should people worship? And so she's sort of setting up these 2 places of worship, and Jesus is going to point out it's not about Mount Gerizim or about Jerusalem, although Jerusalem is the place where God had set up for his temple to be. That's accurate. But Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. So he doesn't say none of that matters, but there's coming an hour when it's not going to be the issue. The issue won't be where you worship, but how you worship. So not Mount Gerizim, but not really Jerusalem either. Verse 23, an hour is coming, and now is when the true worshipers, and notice Jesus says this is already arrived. It's already here. When the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Now, notice how he repeats that. Spirit and truth. spirit and truth. You see, the Jews had failed to worship in spirit. They had the truth. They had the truth that, God had worked in and through in a place called the temple to look forward to something. But they had missed the spirit part. The Samaritans had failed to worship in truth. They had a measure of, let's stick with worship. Let's worship the God who's there. I think in a sense they still do, but they miss part of the truth. And so neither one is right. It must be both together. Notice the Samaritans had a zeal. They still have, I think, a zeal without knowledge. The Jews had knowledge, but there was a zeal problem. Remember how Jesus had gone in and cleansed the temple, and the disciples had remembered that passage. The zeal of his father's house, of my father's house, has eaten me up. The Jews had missed the zeal, but they had the knowledge. You need both. You need both. Verse 25, the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming. And then John the writer just inserts, he who is called Christ. So notice that both terms are there. One is Hebrew, one is Greek. They mean the same thing, the anointed one. When that one comes, he, that is the Messiah, he will declare all things to us. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am, and our translators added the word he because I think that's understood. But really, he says, the one speaking to you, I am. And that's those I am statements. Catch them in the Gospel of John, because we're going to see them again and again and again. And the ultimate is going to be when we get to John chapter 8, and Jesus is going to say, before Abraham was, I am. But here in this context, I think the translators did right. I am he. I'm the Messiah. Now, Jesus doesn't often reveal himself to people as the Messiah. He's not going to do it publicly during his entire ministry. But he does privately to the Samaritan woman. He says, Messiah, I am the Messiah. You're talking to him. At this point, his disciples came, and they were amazed that he'd been speaking with a woman, yet no one said, what do you seek, or why do you speak with her? So his disciples show up, and frankly, they're surprised, because Jews don't usually talk to Samaritans. And a man usually very circumspectly would talk to a woman. And here you have both of these going on, a Jewish man and a Samaritan woman. And they've learned a little bit, just be careful about trying to correct Jesus. And so they're seeing it, they're puzzled, but they're quiet. They're amazed, they're surprised. Verse 28, so the woman left her water pot. Now remember, that's why she had come. She leaves her water pot. She had come to get water, but she has found something else. She has found, instead of that physical water that she came to get, she has found some spiritual water. And so she leaves the water pot and went into the city and said to the men, I think that's funny on so many levels. First of all, you say, what, she left the water pot. That's because she has become the water pot of living water. She's become the well. And she goes back to the city, and she said to not just to the people, you could say that in a more generic way, but that's not what's here. This is not anthropos. This is the aner. This is the men, the masculine ones. You could almost say the husbands, but I think men works. Remember, when you talked about the word for husband was the same word for a man. Like I have my man, I have my husband. But she said to the men, "Come see a man who told me all of the things I have done." And I can imagine, well, did my wife hear this? What are those things that you've done? Come see a man who told me all the things I have done. Now that phrase, come see a man who told me all of the things that I've done. Remember when we were back in John chapter 3, where we read that everyone who does evil hates the light? and does not come to the light lest his deeds should be exposed. The light tells you what you've done, and people that do evil don't want their deeds to be exposed. But this woman comes up and says, her deeds had been exposed by the light. Hey, he's told me all the things I've done. Come see this. Isn't this great? The very thing, I want you to see this, the very thing that makes an unbeliever hate the light brings this woman to faith, and she can't wait to tell other people about it. What a difference that makes when you are in the light. So she left her water pot, went into the city, said to the men, come see a man who told me all the things I've done. This is not the Christ, is it? And the way she phrases that, it sounds like it, she words it in a way that it expects a negative answer. This couldn't be the Christ, instead of, is this the Christ? Like maybe expecting a positive answer. This is expecting, in the Greek text, a negative answer. Not that she doesn't believe he's the Messiah. He said he was, and I think she believed it. But when she addresses the men, she doesn't say, hey, I found the Messiah. They would have just dismissed that. And so instead, there's a little reverse psychology going on where she says negatively, this couldn't be the Christ, could it? And they're going to now go for themselves. Verse 30, they went out of the city and were coming to him. And meanwhile, notice the camera switches back. While that's all happening in the city, meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. After all, they had gone into town to get something to eat. They'd gone into a Samaritan out town. I'm not sure if their reception had been all that nice, but they had gotten some food. And they come back, and here's the food, the hamburgers, whatever they had brought. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. And he's speaking of a spiritual food. And they don't think spiritual. So the disciples were saying to one another, no one brought him anything to eat, did he? Did that woman bring him something to eat? Yeah, I saw the water pot, but they're taking his words at physical value, the same as she did. Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. That's my nourishment. I came to be nourished. I came to do the work that the Father had for me. Do not say, by the way, notice, my food is to do his will, but also to accomplish his work. That's why Jesus came, to do God's will, but there's a work to be accomplished. Verse 35, do not say there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest. For behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest. Now, that's both speaking figuratively, in the sense that, when the harvest gets ready, and when wheat is growing, and it's the end of that spring season, the heads of the wheat actually become a bit whiter, and you can just look out across and see it's ready for the picking. But I suspect as they looked up, they didn't see wheat fields, but they saw people that are just coming out of the city, men of the city that are coming to see Jesus because of this woman. So the fields actually had turned. I'm not sure if they were dressed in white or not, but that's typically what you wear if you're under the sun. You don't want to be cooked by the sun. You're wearing light-colored clothes. Look at the fields; they're white for harvest. Already, he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for eternal life. So there's one who's reaping. Now, this is generic. It's actually a she who was doing the reaping. So that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this case, the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. That's a phrase from Job chapter 31, verse 8. I sent you to reap for that which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. So she was out there sowing the seed, but the people are coming out, and they're going to hear Jesus. They're going to meet him. I'm going to read something into the text that we're not specifically told. I suspect that there's going to be some baptisms. And we saw that the ones who actually did the baptisms were these disciples, so they're going to be physically involved in the reaping of what she has been sowing. And so there's work to be done. and it's going to be done for the next few days, and you have entered into their labor. Verse 39, from that city, many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified. He told me all the things that I've done. That got their attention. They came out. They believed. Verse 40, so when the Samaritans came to Jesus, they were asking him not to leave. That's what you would normally expect from Samaritans and Jews. They were asking him to stay with them. Why don't you stay here? He received a reception among the Samaritans, and he stayed there 2 days. Verse 41, many more believed. So you had some that believed initially, and now that he's staying there, more people hear him, many more believe because of his word. And they were saying to the woman, it is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves and know that this one is indeed, notice what he called, not a prophet, although he was that, not even the Messiah, although he was that. We have heard for ourselves and know that this one is indeed the Savior of the world. There's a wonderful revival that takes place, a wonderful coming to life. We talked in the previous chapter about the new birth. Now we see it taking place, of all places, among these Samaritans. So notice we'd had Nicodemus coming to Jesus and saying, we know that you're a teacher sent from God. We had the woman, when Jesus had mentioned the fact that you have had 5 husbands, I perceive that you're a prophet. We have the woman hearing Jesus say, I am the Messiah, but now, the Savior of the world. Jesus is all of those, but notice the ascending specification of that. He is both the teacher and the prophet and the Messiah, but especially the Savior of the world. Now, I mentioned Jacob back in Genesis, but there's another story there, and I want to point this out. Just not that it really comes into our story, but there was the daughter of Jacob. Remember, there's a story in Genesis 34 where the daughter of Jacob, her name is Dinah. And it's not one of those pleasant stories. It's sort of R-rated, actually, where Dinah encounters a prince of Shechem. Well, here the Samaritan woman from Shechem or the ancient Shechem, now we call it Sychar, encounters Jesus. Back in that story, she was treated as though she were an immoral woman, where she was taken and raped. Now she wasn't, but that's how he treated her. At least that's how her brothers saw it. And here the Samaritan woman who sounds a little bit like she lives like a harlot, but she's treated by Jesus as though she's pure, where he speaks to her, he converses with her, and that's not something Jewish people usually did to either a Samaritan or to a impure woman, a woman who was living that sort of lifestyle. Back in Genesis 34, Simeon and Levi, they actually trick the men of Shechem, and they get them to say, okay, we're gonna unite. You guys all get circumcised, and then they go in and they kill everybody that's there, and it's really a bloodbath. That's what it's not a pleasant story. In this story, Jesus gives not trickery, but he gives truth to the people of that town. In Genesis 34, Shechem is destroyed. Here, Shechem, or Sychar as we're calling it now, is saved, and many come to faith and many believe. It's a beautiful contrast between the two stories.